It bears an image on it, ventral, front, and back, dorsal, of a human figure.
It shows a very faint sort of image of a crucified man. And the crucified man calls us to remember Jesus' death and resurrection.
Deep beneath a private research facility, supercomputers hum like distant thunder. On their screens, a neural network dissects millions of microscopic scans from one forbidden subject, the Shroud of Turin. Then, the data halts. The machine has found something impossible, a repeating mathematical signature hidden within the linen's weave, a pattern so precise it behaves like code. Across the ocean, Mel Gibson listens to the results in a dim studio, fingers pressed to his headphones. For decades, he's chased this mystery through archives, cathedrals, and laboratories, quietly funding research others called madness.
It does actually go back to that time period. For a while, they were testing pieces that had been repaired in the 13th century.
Now the AI has confirmed what he suspected all along. The image on the cloth isn't art or accident. It's information. A record written in light, preserved in fiber, waiting 2,000 years for someone, an actor, a director, a believer, to finally understand what it means. The image that refused to be art. Gibson's obsession didn't begin in a church. It began in a darkroom. He saw a century-old photograph, Secondopia's 1898 negative of the Shroud, and watched the ghost become a face. A normal negative turns darkness into light. The Shroud's negative revealed a positive, detailed portrait, a photographic effect on fabric centuries before photography existed. That alone would have been enough to bother a filmmaker's mind. But the deeper he looked, the more it refused to behave like art. Where was the pigment? Where were the brushstrokes? Why didn't dyes or binders show up under spectroscopy? Why did the coloration sit only on the outermost microfibers, hundreds of nanometers deep, barely grazing the linen's surface like sunburn on a single skin cell? A human hair is about 80,000 nanometers thick. The Shroud's image depth is measured in hundreds. On film sets, Gibson would stand with paint supervisors and VFX teams, talking about how light wraps a surface. The Shroud seemed to encode light into linen without saturating it. That is not how paint behaves. That is not how dye behaves. That is not how any medieval technique behaves. Then there was the 3D data. In the 1970s, researchers fed photographs of the Shroud into the VP8 image analyzer, the same system used to generate relief maps of planetary surfaces. A normal photograph collapses when you push it through a VP8. The Shroud didn't. Its image intensity correlated with distance, producing a coherent 3D relief of a human form, not an illusion of depth. Depth information. When Gibson first saw the reconstruction, it felt like a filmic trick he hadn't figured out yet. A special effect done by a machine that didn't exist at the time the cloth appeared. He kept reading. He learned about the 1532 fire, the backing cloth, and the careful patches. He learned about 1988, when Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona ran accelerator mass spectrometry on a corner sample and declared the cloth medieval 1260 to 1390 AD, case closed. Except it wasn't. Raymond Rogers, a Los Alamos chemist involved in the broader research effort, obtained leftover threads from the very area that had been tested. Under the microscope, he found cotton interwoven with linen and a plant gum with dye, signatures of a medieval reweave. The lab-dated threads weren't original to the main cloth. The dating, he argued, belonged to a repair, not the relic. Gibson didn't file that as gotcha. He filed it as open case. If the sample wasn't original, the verdict couldn't be either. He watched as other methods entered the ring: vibrational spectroscopy, X-ray scattering, molecular aging of cellulose, and isotopic studies on the flax. None was as canonized as radiocarbon dating, but the pattern they traced pointed older and pointed east, to the Levant, where the story attached to the Shroud first began. Meanwhile, forensic analyses piled up. Blood flows that matched upright scourging, bent forward beam carrying, and crucifixion on the cross. Anatomical detail far beyond medieval convention. The more Gibson listened, the less the word forgery sounded like a scientific conclusion, and the more it sounded like a placeholder for, "We don't have the mechanism." A director's instinct is to ask the mechanism question. What made the image? No pigment, no binder, no capillarity into the threads, a depth no brush can paint, a relief map your camera can't fake. The old answers fell away, and in their place, he began to suspect something blasphemously simple. The image might not be an artifact at all. It might be the footprint of a phenomenon. When science fought itself, the temptation is to turn a mystery into a referendum. Relic versus forgery, faith versus reason, believers versus skeptics. Gibson refused that cut. He wanted the fight inside the data, not outside it. He sat with physicists who had never set foot in a cathedral. They talked about corona discharge, ultraviolet bursts, particle cascades, and heat spikes that could tan the top fibrils without baking the threads below. Hotter than the sun, but only skin deep, one told him, and turned off before the linen knows it's dying. They'd tried it all. Hot statues, acid washes, laser tanning, ionizing radiation, dust transfer. Every experiment could mimic a feature. None could replicate the ensemble. Superficiality, resolution, 3D correlation, and that maddening lack of directionality, as if the image formed outward from every point simultaneously. If an energy event made the image, it wasn't a stove or a brush or a lamp. It was something that imprinted distance into brightness, something that carried geometry in its breath. Then came 2024, and with it, an opportunity the old studies never had. The team Gibson had quietly funded arranged access to ultra-high-resolution digital scans of the shroud, multispectral, calibrated, fiber-level detail. They sent the data through a battery of neutral algorithms, principal component analysis to peel signal from noise, symmetry detectors to hunt repeating structure, correlation engines to test whether intensity variations could be predicted across the cloth. The mandate to the machines was brutal and honest. Find a pattern. Don't care what it means. Don't care who it hurts. The outputs were not religious. They were mathematical. Across the face and hands and torso, faint but coherent symmetries emerged. Relationships were trained to miss because the human eye is a romantic, not a statistician. Distances lined up as if laid against a geometric scaffolding. Ratios repeated. The golden section appeared where no medieval rules demanded it. The clusters that PCA considered most informative weren't the obvious features of portraiture. They were the tacit alignments beneath them, the way proportion itself held firm even where threads were charred or warped or folded. A skeptical control always matters. They fed the same pipeline with other ancient linens and with painted icons. Nothing. The code wasn't in the weave. It wasn't in the color. It was in the way this image alone stored information. When a musician hears a chord, they can name it by ear. When an algorithm hears a chord, it can tell you the ratios. The shroud's chords weren't music, but they were ratios, and they were consistent, and they repeated across the cloth. The conclusion was not message hidden under image. It was stranger. Order beneath depiction. That's when Gibson's tone changed. He stopped asking whether the image was real. He started asking whether it had been rendered. The code under the cloth. Here is the quiet confession Mel Gibson has avoided for years, and the one he finally admits. The Shroud of Turin looks like a recording of an event that obeyed rules we are only now learning to write down. He calls it the coded cloth, not to mystify it, but to describe how it behaves. An artist paints with pigment. A process writes with pattern. The algorithms saw the pattern. First, the three-dimensional law. The darkness of each point on the image tracks how near that part of the cloth would have been to a body, closer, darker, farther, lighter, across the entire field, not just in convenient areas. That correlation is so steady that the system could reconstruct a relief map. A painter creates the illusion of depth by intuition. The shroud carries a rule about depth, like a camera without glass. Second, the superficial law. The color, mellow yellow oxidation/dehydration of the top fibrils, stops at a microscopic frontier. No oversaturation, no bleed into the thread body, no capillary smear. Consistent depth at the nanometric scale. A brush would break that boundary by accident. A lamp would break it by heat flow. A chemical bath would break it by diffusion. Whatever did this, respect the line between seen and safety. Third, the geometric law. The detectors picked up repeating ratios. Not a decorative overlay, but a scaffolding that seemed to guide how features related, even where the fabric was distorted by age. The space between the eyes, the length of the metacarpals, the arc of the ribs. None exactly perfect, because linen ages and life isn't a diagram, but statistically bound to a consistent proportion, as if the image wasn't assembled piece by piece, but manifested all at once under a global constraint. Is that proof of anything beyond a fascinating physical process? Not by itself. Gibson is careful to say that, but it is why he now uses the word recording. A recording is not a painting. A recording bears the marks of the apparatus that made it. If the apparatus was energy, then the marks will be energy's mathematics. If it happened in space, the result will honor geometry. If it was fast, the result would be shallow. If it was everywhere at once, the result will have no brush direction at all. He circles back to the burst theories, the corona discharges, the UV flashes, the particle showers, and shows where each succeeds and fails. Yes, brief UV bursts can color fibrils without scorching the threads below. No, they don't trivially encode whole cloth distance laws. Yes, corona discharges can cause superficial changes. No, none have revealed the under-image symmetry the algorithms found. Researchers can approximate attributes. They cannot yet replicate the orchestra. What about the 1988 medieval verdict? He doesn't wave it away. He situates it. The sample came from a complicated corner, a corner that had been handled, repaired, and weighted by centuries. A corner that Rogers showed to be chemically unlike the larger field. To Gibson, that means the debate about date might be absolutely vital and simultaneously irrelevant. If the image formation process can be detected independent of the textile's age, then the argument about when takes second place to the question of how. If a medieval patch fooled a date, it tells you about the patch, not the process. What process writes distance into brightness and stops precisely at a nanometer boundary? That question, he insists, survives any lab's anxiety. He talks about forensics that read like a script page, vertical blood flows like those from upright scourging, diagonal flows like those from bent forward beam carrying, horizontal flows like those associated with extended arms. He emphasizes that blood first matters, scourge marks that appear to be genuine bloodstains with serum halos, not painted. Whoever did this, he says without sarcasm, was an expert in 20th century forensics in the 14th. And then he tells the story he had been hiding. The team fed the scans through one last model, a high-capacity net trained not on images, but on geometry. Its job: propose the simplest generative rules that could yield what the shroud contains. The machine proposed a set of constraints, a family of global equations that would, if applied across a flexible surface, produce a field like the shroud's: shallow, symmetric, distance true. Not a message, but a method. Not words, a witness. I realized, he says softly, I wasn't looking at an artist's hand. I was looking at a moment. What about the quantum talk that swirls online? The claims that constants from atomic physics are encoded in linen, the whispers about holographic projection matrices and coherence fields. Gibson is cautious. He doesn't rule out the language. He rules out certainty. He notes that when patterns repeat at many scales, mathematically literate people will start seeing their favorite constants everywhere. He also notes that some patterns do appear where they shouldn't if the shroud were simply a photograph or a rub. He reminds you that the best minds he met were excited and irritated by the same thing. The image behaves like a phenomenon, not a painting. And we don't yet have instruments to reproduce the phenomenon on a sheet of linen without destroying it. He calls the Vatican conservators heroically patient. He calls the skeptics necessary. He calls the credulous dangerous. And he calls the data unruly. What he admits, and what comes next. Gibson's admission is not that he can prove the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. His admission is narrower and, in some ways, heavier. That after decades of following the facts, he believes the shroud carries a mathematically ordered, physically constrained record of an event that has no medieval analog, and that modern attempts to mimic its ensemble have not succeeded. He admits he's making a film. He admits it will not be about the shroud in the way the last film was about the Passion. It will be about the collision between narrative and number, how a disputed relic forced machines to read geometry and fabric, how a cloth became a laboratory, how the arguments about date, place, and authenticity are now being joined by a more basic question. What is this image? He admits he changed his mind about one word: forgery. He no longer believes the shroud can be contained by it, because forgery is a human craft word, and the image behaves like a physical law. He admits he doesn't know the mechanism. He wants you to know that too. He wants you to hear the humility in that sentence, not the evasion. The point of the lab, as he sees it, is not to reinforce a catechism. It is to measure. If the measurements keep coming back with the same chords, then the right reaction isn't triumph. It's attention. He tells a small story almost no one knows. In a basement archive, a technician unfolded a reproduction next to a high-resolution print of the face. The reproduction was beautiful. The print was disturbing. The copy looks like a painting, the tech said. The photo looks like a witness. The distinction is everything to a director. You can shoot a beautiful lie, or you can capture something that won't compose. The shroud refuses composition. It demands calibration. He also says he understands why people recoil. If the image is a record, it is a record of the worst moment becoming the strangest evidence. It turns cruelty into a coordinate system. It turns death into a data set. You can call that offensive. You can call it holy. Either way, it resists being ignored. So what does he want? He wants the data and the doubts in the same room. He wants the images open to more teams with more algorithms and fewer agendas. He wants the radiocarbon debate resolved with more than blog posts and press releases. He wants the mechanism hunt funded enough to fail in public a dozen more times. He wants the public to stop needing the shroud to be something safe. He wants you to look again and ask the simplest scientific question. If it isn't paint, and it isn't heat, and it isn't contact, what is it? He wants the answer to hurt a little, because that's how you know you're close. He ends where he began, in a studio, mic on, lights low, eyes unblinking. He says he is not finished. He says the film won't be a verdict. It will be a map of the fight. He says the cloth has a way of making careful men sound like poets and making loud men sound small. He says he is deeply tired of certainty and deeply hungry for proof. He says he is ready to be wrong in the right direction. And then, for the first time, he calls it by a name that isn't about faith or argument or fame. He calls it evidence, not of doctrine, of an event. If the shroud is a record, then it will survive our disbelief. If the shroud is a phenomenon, then our instruments will finally catch up. If the shroud is both, then we will have learned something rare, that sometimes the past doesn't sit in a museum. It leans forward under the light and asks whether your math is ready. If you're still here, you're part of the frequency. Hit subscribe and stay tuned for more fascinating stories like this. Thanks for watching.